Yeah, I'm just starting the live stream.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. I know folks are still starting to kind of tune in. This is going to be a AMA session. I'm coming to you straight from the Sweet Maria's warehouse. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Ryan. I am the merchandise manager. I do a lot of demos and events and some educational stuff, as well as contributing to the blog. Yeah, so just start typing in your questions, send them to me in a message, and I will get started answering anything. I know a lot of people are stuck at home, so if you have questions specifically about like home roasting, home brewing, anything like that, just send it on in and I'll be here to answer your questions. Yes, yes, yes. Any questions? Ask me anything. Hopefully there are a lot of folks at home right now, social distancing. Oh, let's see. What are my thoughts on coffee profiling? Thanks for the question, Change Jeff. Did you have any specific things about like coffee profiling, how to like build a curve? Um, let's see, basics about the Maillard phase. Um, in general, in terms of coffee profiling, start with something basic. Um, I'm not sure exactly what your question is regarding, Jeff, in terms of what information you want for coffee profiling, in terms of like building a profile or something like that. Obviously, you want your temperature to be increasing, but after a certain point, you want the rate at which the temperature is increasing, the ROR, to kind of start to level off, to prevent your coffee from taking off and going crazy. Since during the drying stage, it's kind of taking on a lot of energy, and then once you hit the first crack, there's a lot of energy being expelled. There's no like specific set profile that is like my go-to, I would say. Obviously, the profiling you use is going to depend a lot on like the coffee that you're using and the exact roaster that you're using. I usually tend to preheat a lot, kind of ramp up my heat in the first few minutes. Having trouble with a Kenyan crashing. Okay, so you're kind of like not getting enough energy in, Jeff. It looks like, so for anyone who's following along, Jeff is having trouble with a Kenyan coffee that is crashing. That usually means you're not pushing in enough energy. So what I would usually recommend, I try to pull back on energy right before first crack just to keep it from kind of taking off. You might be pulling back too much or taking away too much energy, so make sure to kind of hold back on that as much as possible. Let's see. Preheating benefits, ideal temp. Okay, so in terms of preheating, one of the reasons why I tend to like to preheat has to do with a lot of home roasters take a really long time to heat up, and take a greater amount of time to kind of change energy just because of electrical heating elements taking a long time, that kind of a thing. Unless you're dealing with something like a bullet or a Quest or a hot top. Even the hot top takes a little bit of time to warm up. There's not like an ideal temperature necessarily. A lot of it depends on how you're reading your temperature and where your temperature probe is. Usually on like the big Probat drum roaster that we use for like our production roasts and that kind of a thing, we will preheat up to like 400 degrees or so. And then once we hit that point, maybe like 420, Once we hit that point, we'll add our coffee. One of the reasons why preheating is good is because you're already getting energy in there. As soon as you add a bunch of cold beans, the temperature is going to drop really quickly. Um, yeah, let's see. That's what I would say about preheating, especially if you're using something that takes a little bit of while to heat up. It can help prevent your coffee from getting baked or anything like that. Let's see. Okay, so we have a question about anaerobic processing. Have we tried any anaerobic processed coffees? Have we carried any? Um, let's see, contained anaerobic. So anaerobic processing is kind of a blend between like washed and natural processing. So once the coffee is kind of stuck into a water tank, it's been hulled, so the outside layer of the coffee is removed, put into a water tank, and then it's left to ferment in an anaerobic environment, an airtight container filled with water. Anaerobic just means free of oxygen, so it's not being exposed to the outside air. We actually, I don't know if anyone remembers, I think it was about a year ago, we carried an anaerobic processed coffee from El Salvador. I've also had a chance to try some of coffees that were anaerobically processed over at the Royal Cupping Lab, which are really, really great. We definitely are interested in carrying more anaerobic processed coffees moving forward. That said, there is like a fair amount of, it's still very early stages with that kind of processing method. It's really expensive and requires a lot of care, time, and attention. So it's not something that's available to all farms or all farmers. It's also kind of up in the air how big of a difference that makes in terms of cup quality or effects on the cup and whether or not it's actually worth the cost of going into it. So a lot of people are kind of playing around with that, anaerobic maceration, different things like that. We're really interested in that. We want to keep cupping, keep trying things. One of the ideas behind anaerobic processing is that it keeps things very controlled. So it's kind of taking some of the concepts from like winemaking and that kind of stuff and applying it towards coffee. We'll see. It's definitely something interesting that we'd like to, carry more in the future. Yeah, that's what I would say about that. Let's see. So Angela is asking, she recently upgraded to a fresh roast. I'm guessing either the SR400 or the SR800. She's having some trouble hearing the first and second cracks. Usually, it's pretty easy to hear the cracks in the fresh roast. I know some people who have the fresh roast 800 versus 540. Those larger batch sizes are going to take a little bit longer to roast. So rather than the kind of like 8 to 10 minute roast that you might expect with the smaller batch size, it can get closer to like a 15-minute roast. I noticed that with a lot of, especially my really hard, dense beans, I wasn't hitting first crack until deeper into the roast, like 13 minutes, 15 minutes, that kind of a thing. Cup quality ended up coming out great, didn't taste like baked or anything like that. So it's possible that if you're not hearing the first and second cracks, that you're not quite getting there. You shouldn't hear second cracks if you're aiming for a City Plus roast anyways. City Plus roast, you're gonna kind of go right through first crack until you hit the end of first crack and then drop it. Usually if I'm aiming for a really light roast, like a city roast, I might even start cooling when I'm like near the tail end of first crack or before I've actually ended first crack. Again, if you're ever having issues with your roaster, think it's underpowered, having trouble with a specific bean, everyone should definitely send us an email to info@sweetmarias.com. We're always there, always answering. We want to help you guys get the best results you can. Okay, so Deb and Nate Fry are using a Behmor to roast, and it doesn't give you temperature. How do you keep control of the roast? Any advice on getting the best roast? With the Behmor, it doesn't give you the bean temperature. It doesn't have a probe actually in the drum, and it's one of those roasters that you really can't even add your own probe because of the design of the roaster and the way that the drum rotates. So you'll immediately get your probe tangled up. In terms of that being said, you can get different temperature settings, especially if you look at your manual. I'm going to be honest and say I haven't used the Behmor recently, so I can't tell you exactly what button to press. But you can press and see their temperature readings. So even though it's not necessarily a bean temp that you can take and apply to, you know, an artisan profile or something like that that you're downloading from the internet, you can use their temperature readings as a mark, record those, and kind of take a look at your curve and see how that's going and whether or not that's looking good. A lot of times I just will start with one of the presets, try it out, and then kind of make adjustments from there with the Behmor. What kind of license is required to sell roasted coffee? That's from Oyuki. Excuse my pronunciation if that's wrong. The kind of licensing you're going to need to sell roasted coffee is going to depend state by state, so definitely recommend reaching out to, you know, your state's to find out exactly what the specific regulations are. I know a lot of home roasters who are selling their coffee online will get like a cottage kitchen license. That's something that's really common in California, which is where we're based. That just allows you to commercially sell things that you're making in a home kitchen without having to get inspections and that kind of a thing. Let's see. Okay. Okay, yes, so Byron just chimed in. Behmor's B button will show the chamber temp. So Roger Johnson is asking a question about his Behmor 1600. He's doing a 1 pound roast, just over 10 minutes, and it starts to drop. Let's see, I haven't had experience with that. I know that in my experience with the Behmor, kind of like 12-ounce roast batches have been better for me than 1 pound batch sizes. Let's see the actual temper chamber reads. I'm not sure exactly what you might be experiencing, Roger. I would definitely recommend reaching out to Behmor's technical support. You can email them at tech@behmor.com. They always get to you right away. Bob handles most of their technical support. He's super knowledgeable, super helpful. He will definitely be able to chime in on that and let you know what's going on. So Matt Varnum is asking, can you give some advice on roasting for espresso? And when we label beans as good for espresso, what qualities are you seeing? I know Dan Wood is in here. He's one of our coffee buyers. He writes almost all of the coffee reviews, so he's the person who's kind of determining whether or not he thinks a coffee would be good for espresso. There are no hard and fast rules. Usually there are certain varietal aspects or aspects of a specific coffee that can make it better or worse for espresso. If a coffee is super bright, super acidic, really kind of like poppy, sometimes those characteristics can become overwhelming as an espresso, like really sour, really tart, those kinds of things. Sometimes if a coffee is really delicate, it just doesn't quite have like the body to kind of hold up to espresso extraction. It just kind of loses it, and it's going to feature much better as a brewed coffee. Again, there's no hard and fast rules. So depending on what you're looking for, you can always take one of our coffees that doesn't say good for espresso, try it as espresso. I think you'll probably find that it's going to be a little bit more difficult to dial in on your espresso machine. A lot of times when I'm looking for what's going to make a good espresso, I'm looking at that body on the flavor wheel to see how much body is in the coffee. That's going to be a good indicator for me about whether or not it's going to make a good espresso. Some of it also depends on your preference. I like really wild kind of fruity espressos, so I'm really into using like a dry processed Ethiopian as espresso. Other people really hate that. Some coffees will do better as milk drinks. Some will do better as just a straight espresso. I know like one of the reasons why espresso blends can be so great, even though sometimes blends get a bad name, is because they tend to be really balanced, and you can have maybe something that really pops and is really great and has like a really delicious flavor balanced out with something like a Brazilian coffee or an Indonesian coffee that has kind of like big body, big chocolate notes to kind of round it out as an espresso. Again, as far as roasting espresso, there's no hard and fast rules. A lot of times you'll hear like espresso roast. there's no particular roast level or roast profile that is good for espresso. Actually, if you're familiar with decent espresso machines, one of the really cool things that they're doing is kind of changing up how they're pulling espresso and how their machine pulls espresso to make it much easier to pull a good shot of espresso with a lighter roasted coffee, because those can be really difficult to dial in. Usually I would say I tend to go a little bit more development with my espresso, even though it doesn't need to be a dark roast by any means, just because that can help kind of develop a little bit more body in the coffee, cut down on some of that acidity, bring out a little bit more of the chocolate notes that I like in an espresso, and tends to be a little bit easier to work with depending on what kind of espresso machine you're using. Let's see. Yep, and it looks like for anyone who's interested in reading more, we have a lot of espresso pages and that kind of stuff. And you can also send us an email. We're always happy to help. Yeah, I don't know. It depends. Let's see. Any other questions? Folks who are around? I can kind of just go off on things. Hope everyone's staying safe, staying healthy. Let's see. What are my favorite beans at the moment? Thanks for the question, Edmund. It's been a little tricky. I'm sure all of you guys have noticed we've experienced a really huge volume of coffee orders, kind of in light of some of the shelter at home things, that kind of a thing. So coffees have been kind of coming onto our list and leaving the list really, really quickly. I'm definitely a person who tends to gravitate towards really floral coffees, really fruity coffees, those kinds of things. Because of that, I often am drawn towards Africa as a region. But we also have had some really great kind of like fruity coffees from Colombia and Guatemala coming through recently that are great. In general, we've been kind of starting to push out some of our newer offerings from Burundi and Rwanda. I really love those coffees. Sometimes people are a little bit wary about Burundi and Rwanda because they have a reputation for having more issues with the potato defect, which is actually caused by insect damage. Anyways, even when I get a slight potato or a little bit of potato with my Burundi or Rwanda, it's still worth it for me. These are really interesting, complex coffees. Oftentimes they're gonna have really great kind of like baking spice notes and kind of black tea qualities, a little bit more tannic, mixed with chocolate and some really like kind of a bright sparkling acidity. So they're really complex, really sweet, tend to do really nicely, particularly Rwanda as like dual use coffees. So coffees that are going to be really good as brewed coffee and also work really nicely as a single origin espresso. I think right now we have the Burundi Matamba Rugembe Hill coffee. We roasted that in the office. That's what I'm drinking today. It's just like so delicious, so sweet. A really, really great coffee. So that's definitely one I would recommend checking out. Another cool thing about Burundi in particular is that's a region where we've realized you can have much more of an impact on kind of like the farmers and the people who are working there for a lot of reasons. If you go to our blog post, Tom has written about this extensively, so that's really great. Let's see. Best method of pour over. So again, this is going to kind of depend on what kind of qualities you're looking to get out of your coffee. I'm a little bit of a nerd in this regard, so I have a lot of different pour over methods at home that I'll use for different things. My kind of everyday coffee maker is just a Chemex, super easy, cone, kind of like go Chemex or other coffee makers that use paper filter are going to be really great, going to give you really good clarity. You're not going to have a lot of silt in there. Really kind of clean cups of coffee from anything with a paper filter, versus if you're using like a metal filter or a cloth filter, that's going to let through more of the oils. So you're going to end up with a little bit more of like a rounder cup, a little bit more body, a little bit heavier, which is something I really like. A lot of times when I'm at home, I'll use my little nail pot, which is a Hario product that uses a flannel filter, because I like kind of like a smaller, really round cup, and the extra sediment in the cup doesn't bother me. In terms of ease of use, that kind of a thing, a lot of times people will gravitate directly towards something like a V60 because they've seen it in their coffee shop. They hear it's kind of like the gold standard. If you're a really big nerd and you like practicing and you want to get your flow rate perfect and you have your gooseneck kettle, then I think a V60 is great. I think it's really fun. It makes a really great cup of coffee. But because it has just like a really big hole at the bottom, it's definitely a little bit more challenging. It asks a lot more from kind of the home brewer compared to some other drippers like the Kalita or the Bon Mac that have just the small holes, and they'll do some of the flow regulation for you. It's really easy to make a bad cup of coffee on a V60. It's much more difficult to make a really bad cup of coffee on like the Bon Mac or the Kalita because it's doing some of the work for you. It also depends what equipment you have. If you don't have access to a gooseneck kettle or something like that, it's going to be a lot harder to do a really controlled pour, that kind of a thing. So that is also going to kind of narrow down what method of pour over is going to be best for you. I know I just got a Clever dripper and brought it to my parents. They'd used a French press in the past, but my mom has switched to only decaf, so my dad didn't want to make a big like 12-cup French press every time he wanted coffee. That's a super easy way of making a really delicious cup of coffee. Again, because it uses the paper filter, it's going to be just as easy as a French press, if not easier in terms of cleanup. But it makes a single cup, and the paper filter is going to give you a lot of clarity in your cup. One thing with like something like a French press is because you're just pressing down and then the coffee can sit in there for a while. Sometimes even though all of the grounds have been put to the bottom, they're going to continue to extract because they're still in contact with the water. So it can make your coffee kind of taste a little bit bitter as you get further down into the carafe. Let's see. Does stirring or agitating the grounds in a Chemex make a difference? Or do you just leave the grounds alone? Thanks for the question, Jake. It kind of depends on what you're doing. One of the nice things about stirring or agitating is it can get a more even extraction, so you don't have to worry as much about like if you're channeling in your bed or anything like that. But that kind of agitation is also going to speed up extraction. A lot of times I'll recommend stirring or agitating in the Chemex to people who don't have really great gooseneck kettles or flow regulation, that kind of a thing. I had a friend who only had like a big kettle, a big electric kettle with just a normal spout, so he was struggling with his Chemex, but by doing kind of like a pulse pour and then stirring and then doing a larger pulse pour and stirring, it allowed him to get a really great cup of coffee out of the Chemex. So there's no hard and fast rules. I really like experimenting. I recommend doing like side-by-side testing, especially if you're stuck at home and don't have a lot to do. That's a really fun kind of like thing to do. Some blind testing, figure out exactly what you like the most. One resource I would definitely recommend checking out is Prima Coffee. They have some really interesting articles that they've written about different brew methods and kind of different ways of brewing on the same thing. So I know they have an article about a Chemex where they prepare it using recipes from like 5 or 6 different cafes, brewing the same coffee, and kind of compare them and see what difference that makes in the cup. So I think that might be a good thing for you to check out, Jake. Let's see. Brian Morris, hey, this might be a dumb question, but is there a way to sort your coffees by score? So Brian, unfortunately, this is not a stupid question. First off, a lot of people ask us all the time about whether or not you can sort by score on our green coffee list. Right now you can't. And the reason for that is because Score is only going to give you a little bit of information about the coffee. We wanted to make people do a little bit more work up front in terms of looking at those scores, which I know can be a little annoying, and I know that we're kind of working on making it a little bit easier to navigate the green coffee list. Um, but two coffees could have the exact same score and taste completely different and have totally different qualities. So if someone is just ordering based on score, they might get a super floral Ethiopian that scores 92 in cupping, and then they roast it to like a French roast and don't understand why it doesn't taste good and why they can't taste any of those kind of floral qualities in the coffee. It seems like it's not super sweet or something like that. If you like something like a Sumatra or Indonesian because you like a really earthy, kind of like big bodied, maybe some of those tobacco notes, um, you're never going to see a Sumatran or Indonesian coffee scoring those super high scores. The cupping kind of values certain characteristics over others, so that's part of the reason why we've decided to not allow people to just totally cup by score. I would say the most useful way to use the cupping scores is in conjunction with the flavor wheels, and then also comparing different coffees from the same region, because usually those are going to be a little bit more similar. So if you're trying to decide between which Colombia you want to order, the cupping score can be a good indicator of like, okay, like this might be something that's a little bit more what I'm looking for. But if you're comparing, it's kind of like an apples and oranges thing. So that's what I would say. Um, so Chris is asking, when brewing, do you weigh the beans or the grounds? I always weigh the beans before I've started doing it. So I'll have a little cup, I'll dose out how many beans I want to use for my dose, and then I'll go ahead and grind those beans. That way I don't have a lot of coffee sitting in the hopper of my grinder. And I know that it's exactly the right amount. Then I'll put my brewer on top of my scale, tear it out, and put the coffee in to make sure there's not a ton of coffee stuck in the grinder and that all of it made it into the pour over device, whatever it is I'm using that day. Okay, so Deb and Nate are asking what the ideal rest time is for their coffee. Again, I know this isn't the most edifying answer, but it kind of depends on the coffee. It depends on your brew method. There's no hard and fast rules. I would definitely recommend waiting at least, 12, 24 hours after you've roasted, just because there's still a lot of gases coming out. So if you brew it right away, one, it tends to taste really roasty, a little bit more kind of like charred burned, even if it's a really light roast, just because it's freshly cooked. But also it can have some kind of like weird, funky, wild tastes, especially if you're pulling espresso because of all those gases that are still stuck in the coffee. There are some coffees that do better with a little bit more rest. One coffee in particular is like coffees from Brazil. You can often see Dan put it in his descriptions when he writes a review, best with, 3 to 5 days rest or something like that. Just to give it a little bit more time to kind of like settle and mellow out. It also depends on brew application. I would say for like just doing like a pour over or brewed coffee, I'm kind of the mindset that fresher is better. Oftentimes I'll find my pour over coffee peaking maybe, 2 to 5 days off roast. Usually the first day they're still like a little weird, a little funky. But with espresso, I like to give it much more rest, much more time to kind of like mellow out and sit. Back when I was a barista, we had kind of like our house espresso blend, and we would make sure that was at least 10 days off roast before we'd put it in the hopper. So it just kind of depends. It's personal preference. Obviously, like if you're using something like an airscape container or anything airtight to store your coffee, that's going to keep it fresh a lot longer. So that's definitely something I would recommend. Okay, so Morgan Edward is asking how to get a good city to city plus roast on the electric popcorn roaster. So this is definitely something that takes a little bit of skill because that particular roaster, the one that we carry is the Nostalgia. works so quickly. So even if you can just like blast right through and, you know, in the space of like between 3 minutes to 4 minutes, like run right through first crack into second crack. Um, there are a few things that I like to do to kind of slow down my popcorn roast a little bit, just to give myself a little bit more control. I'll use a slightly smaller batch size. Sometimes I'll use like an extension cord or a power strip to kind of cut the voltage that's running into the popper. That can make a surprising difference. Taking that plastic piece off the top to kind of give it a little bit more air. Again, chaff is going to be flying everywhere, but it can cool it down. And ambient temperature has a really big impact. So roasting outside or roasting somewhere really cold can help kind of slow it down a little bit. The other thing is if I'm aiming for like a city roast or a city plus roast in a popper, I'm going to be dumping my roast while it's still in the middle of first crack because it's going to keep running right through. A lot of times that's actually what roasters are doing on their really big, you know, gas powered drum roasters is they're dropping coffee while it's still in the middle of first crack because there's so much energy stored in the beans that it's not going to stall out. It's going to continue through and be well enough developed, but that keeps it from getting too hot too fast or like running right through the roast. Another thing you can do is up your cooling game because coffee tends to, once it's dumped, it's going to continue to brown and continue to develop unless you cool it down really fast. There are ways to build your own cooling box using like just like a cheap plastic fan, a cardboard box, and like a sifter or something like that. Even just moving it between two colanders to try to suck up as much heat as possible, or use a shop vac underneath a colander does a great job of kind of cooling it down really fast and locking in your roast level where you want it. Okay. So Paul is asking, do you think that honey process is really distinct from pulp natural? Because he's had some trouble roasting these beans from either process. So pulp natural is usually a term that you'll see specifically with Brazilian coffees, versus honey process is something that you're seeing more in kind of like Central America, South America, other regions of South America, and kind of in Africa as well. I do think it's distinct from pulp to natural, again, because pulp natural is usually something from Brazil. It might have a little bit of kind of like fermenty wininess to it in terms of the fruit flavors, but it tends to be a little bit more muddled because it is a lower grown coffee in general, maybe a little bit more on the rustic side, less perceptibly fruity. With something like a honey process, the thing that jumps out to me is just like sweet, 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 sweet. It's usually not going to have the same kind of like berry fruit flavors that you'll see from like a dry processed coffee or another natural processed coffee. But it does have that kind of like big, maybe a little bit more stone fruit, big fruit flavors, kind of citrusy, and tends to be really clean compared to like, again, a drier natural processed coffee. Just because honey processing is a little bit more controlled compared to those other methods. If you are having trouble, Paul, with a specific coffee or aren't quite getting what you want, definitely send us an email about how to kind of bring out maybe more of those fruit flavors. If those are the processing methods you're reaching for, that can be good. In terms of one-dimensional, sometimes if I'm really trying to emphasize fruitiness or stuff like that, I'll kind of stretch out the drying stage a little bit and then give a really big push of energy going into first crack to kind of keep it a little bit more controlled. I hope that helps, Paul. If you do have a specific coffee, especially one that you've gotten from Sweet Maria's, reach out via email and I can give you some more specific information. I think in our roast fundamentals as well, if you go to the Sweet Maria's library, we have a few articles that give some recommendations for how to roast with like a honey processed coffee or a dry processed coffee. Those are going to be a little bit separate, but I would definitely recommend checking that out. Dun, dun, dun. Any other questions? We've got about 10 minutes left of the live stream, so if you do have questions, now is the time. Even if it's just, you know, when am I going to get my order? That kind of a thing. Well, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Okay, so Paul asked whether we're doing roasting on a big Probat or smaller home machines. So just a little bit more information about how we do production roasting here. There are 3 of us that kind of rotate in and out of doing the production roasting. So I will roast maybe like once or twice a month on the big gas-powered Probat roaster that we have. But for the most part, I'm roasting on smaller home machines. As the merchandise manager, I'm doing a lot of returns, testing stuff out, that kind of a thing. Oftentimes I'll be roasting on the Quest, on the Fresh Roast. You know, I have experience with the Hot Top, the Jean Cafe, the Behmor, and the Nostalgia Air Popper, of course, stovetop. So if you do have any questions about a specific roaster, or if you're trying to kind of figure out how to profile in your roaster, let me know what roaster you're using and I can try to give you some tips. Let's see. I will say there are definitely some machines that make it a little bit easier to profile than others. Everything kind of has its, you know, drawbacks. Some are really consistent, always give you a really even roast, but you don't have as much control. Some you have a lot of control, but that means you can also mess it up. So just kind of depends. Okay. So recommendations on grind number setting on the Baratza grinder. So it depends on what Baratza grinder you're using. Most people, I think, have either like the Encore or the Virtuoso at home. If they're doing brewed coffee, it kind of depends on your brew method, definitely, in terms of where you want to be set. I'm usually kind of sticking closer to the middle. There's 40, I believe, grind settings on the Encore. So 20 is kind of in the middle, and then I'll kind of go back and forth, maybe like 5 to 10 settings based on what kind of grind I'm using. It's extremely rare that I'm using the finest grind setting or the coarsest grind setting when working with a Baratza grinder. If I'm doing home brewing, if you're doing like a pour over, that kind of a thing, again, it depends on your brew size, how, you know, your dosage, all of that kind of stuff. You can also mess around with your grind setting a little bit depending on what you like, what you're looking for. If you're just roasted a specific coffee and you notice things aren't turning out, you can make little adjustments that way. Oftentimes, if you're doing your pour over and at the end the bed looks kind of like muddy or silty, it means your grind size is a little bit too fine. You might get a little bit of over extraction. If it's moving through your bed really, really fast, you're probably a little bit too coarse. I think on the Chemex with the Baratza grinder, I'm usually around like, I want to say between like 15 to 20, but I also don't have an Encore at home, so it's been a little bit since I've used it for that. Yeah, I hope that helps. Let's see. So Elijah is roasting on a hot top. Recommendation with Ethiopian naturals. How long for development time? So Elijah, if you want really specific roast profile kind of like recommendations, definitely follow up to this with an email and I can give you kind of a more detailed response to that. I'd be happy to do it. We're a little bit loath to recommend specific roast profiles or like specifics about development time, that kind of a thing, because that stuff can change based on the coffee you're using. But even though something like the hot top is controllable, really great, really consistent, different units can kind of vary in the ways that they work, and it also is dependent on like the ambient temperature and the voltage of your home and those kinds of things. So it can be a little bit different from one person to another. We actually previously did an experiment where multiple members of our staff roasted on a Behmor in different locations, different spots, and even though they were all new Behmors, they all roasted a little bit differently. So that's kind of the reason why we don't publish specific roast profiles. I would definitely recommend, we have a really helpful article in our coffee library that I believe is called Dry Process Coffee Fundamentals. Again, if you send me an email, I can follow up and send you a link to that particular article. My general advice, if you really want to get like more fruity, poppy flavors, is to kind of stretch out the drying stage a little bit and then give it a really nice push of energy going into first crack. Because with a dry process coffee, because there's a lot of mixed densities, those kinds of things, you can have kind of a long, undefined first crack, which is going to muddle up some of those fruit flavors. If you can give it a lot of energy right before first crack and then pull back a little bit once first crack is rolling to keep it from taking off, that can kind of emphasize those like really nice blueberry, berry flavors that you like from a natural coffee. Okay, yeah, so I hope that helps. Yeah, definitely. In terms of drop temperature, Elijah, with a natural, just depends what kind of roast level you're looking for. Yeah. Let's see. Any other questions? Let's see. We've got 3 minutes. So Daniel is asking, can he use the Behmor on a glass top stove in our kitchen with the exhaust fan on? Definitely. The Behmor is a little heavy. If it's glass top stove, definitely be a little bit careful as you're setting it down. I'm sure you don't want your stove to crack. That said, if you're worried about like smoke and exhaust, the Behmor is actually one of the best roasters we carry for roasting inside because it has a built-in catalytic converter, so it's not going to be putting out as much smoke as some of the other roasters we carry, for sure. Having the exhaust fan definitely helps kind of like soak things up and get things out, especially if you're in like an apartment or something like that where you have a sensitive fire alarm, don't want to freak out the neighbors or anything like that. Yeah. Yeah, but the Behmor, you can always use pretty much any of our roasters that will fit on your stove under the exhaust fan. That can be a really nice way of kind of filtering smoke out if you don't have access to like a garage where you can roast, or you know, can't roast outside, that kind of a thing. Luckily for the most part, unless you're roasting really, really dark, because most of the machines we carry have a lower batch size, they're not going to create a whole lot of smoke. Okay. So we have a question about a type of green coffee that's suitable for Turkish coffee with chocolate notes. So if you want something with chocolate notes, I would definitely recommend using some of the flavor filters that we have on our green coffee page. If you look over on the left-hand side when you go to our green coffee list, we have a filter that I believe is bittersweet chocolates. That's going to filter out all the coffees that have really good chocolate notes to it. So that's a good way of kind of narrowing down the list, finding something with chocolate. Another thing I would say, if you want to kind of develop some of those chocolate notes, what a lot of people are picking up when they taste kind of chocolate in coffee is that combination of kind of bitter and sweet. So kind of increasing your development a little bit, maybe going past City or City Plus into more of the Full City Plus range is going to draw out some more of those kind of bitter flavor notes that are reminiscent of chocolate. Yeah, pretty much all coffees are going to have some chocolate notes to them, so I know that can be confusing. But if you want something that's sort of like really smooth chocolatey, usually it's a good idea to stay more to like a Brazilian coffee, a Peruvian coffee, something like that that maybe doesn't have the same kind of acidity that can be off-putting to some people who want just like a straight chocolate cup. Yeah, that's what I would say. But even like a Kenyan coffee, which it tends to be really kind of like poppy and bright, if you roast it darker, some of that acidity is going to go down and more of the chocolate is going to come out. Okay, so we're just about at the end of the AMA. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you do have anything that you need in light of, I know a lot of people are stuck at home, if you have any particular questions, please send us an email to info@sweetmarias.com or post it to our Facebook, and Byron will definitely give you a good response. We're trying to do more of these kind of like virtual events and remote things while some stuff is shut down. So let us know if there's anything specific you guys are looking for, and we'll definitely try to make that happen. Thanks again for tuning in, and I hope you guys all have a great day.